or votes objected to under Clause 6 of Rule 20, the House will resume proceedings on postponed questions at a later time. For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Missouri seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I move to suspend the rules and pass the bill H.R. 2792, the Small Entity Update Act, as amended.
The clerk will report the title of the bill.
H.R. 2792, a bill to require the Securities and Exchange Commission to carry out a study and rulemaking on the definition of the term small entity for purposes of the securities laws and for other purposes.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentlewoman from Missouri, Mrs. Wagner, and the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Waters, each will control 20 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentlewoman from Missouri.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days in which to revise and extend their remarks and include extraneous material on this bill.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, I also ask unanimous consent that the exchange of letters between the committees of jurisdiction be included in the record.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself as much time as I may consume.
Is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today in support of my bill, H.R. 2792, the Small Entity Update Act. Mr. Speaker, the slate of bills that we are considering today are the culmination of 4 hearings that the Capital Markets Subcommittee, which I have the honor and privilege of chairing, has held this year, where we heard from over a dozen witnesses, including founders of private and public companies, investors, former SEC commissioners, security law practitioners, and even one of the authors of the IPO-related provisions of the Jobs Act. All of these bills play a vital role in expanding investment opportunities for all Americans, improving access to capital for small businesses, and strengthening our public markets. 11 years ago, the Jumpstart Our Business Startups Act, or Jobs Act of 2012, was enacted into law by a divided Congress with the intention of increasing access to capital for small businesses and entrepreneurs in the United States. The purpose of the Jobs Act was to provide greater opportunities for small business owners and entrepreneurs to grow their companies and create jobs in their communities. Despite the successes of the Jobs Act, there are still significant regulatory barriers that impede the growth of small businesses and hinder the competitiveness of job growth in the United States. Small businesses, Mr. Speaker, make up 99% of all enterprises and employ almost half of the United States workforce and are disproportionately affected by these barriers. These companies represent the engine of our economy and are far too often subject to one-size-fits-all regulation. The lack of access to capital makes it challenging for small business owners to grow and expand their companies, which can limit job creation and economic growth. That is why I introduced the Small Entity Update Act. This bipartisan bill would direct the SEC to conduct a study followed by a rulemaking that is consistent with the results of such study every 5 years. This study would focus on defining the terms of small entity under the Regulatory Flexibility Act. The regulations often impose disproportionate burdens on startups and small businesses and other small entities. Small entities simply can't afford the number of lawyers and regulatory experts that large multinational firms can to comply with every regulation while still being able to afford the cost of doing business. The government cannot and should not treat a small startup in my hometown of Baldwin, Missouri, with 7 employees as it would a Fortune 500 company. But the reality is that the size of companies and the underlying makeup of market forces behind them change over time, which is why my bill requires the SEC to reevaluate their small business definition every 5 years. Because what makes sense for companies today in terms of regulatory compliance may not in 5 years. My bill addresses longstanding concerns that numerous SEC rules do not appropriately balance the SEC's mandates to protect investors and facilitate capital formation. Studying, and revising these definitions will result in a better understanding of regulatory costs on small entities and ensure that the SEC modernizes its criteria for defining them. In order for our economy to thrive, Mr. Speaker, Congress and regulators must ensure that any policies enacted keep in mind any impacts that would have on our millions of small businesses. H.R. 2792 will lead to a more targeted regulatory framework for these entities and help make the American dream a reality for all entrepreneurs. I want to thank Mr. Himes, Mr. Torres, Mr. Scott, and Mr. Caston for their bipartisan support of this impactful legislation and urge all my colleagues to vote for this bill. Mr. Speaker, I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentlewoman from Missouri reserves. The gentlewoman from California is now recognized.
I yield myself such time as I may consume. I rise in support of H.R. 2792, the Small Entity Update Act, sponsored by the gentlewoman from Missouri. This bill directs the SEC to carry out a study and rulemaking, if appropriate, on its definitions of small entities under the Regulatory Flexibility Act to ensure that the SEC accounts for impacts on small businesses when pursuing rulemakings. The Regulatory Flexibility Act provides small entities with an expanded opportunity to participate in the development of certain regulations. Through the study contemplated under this bill, small entities under SEC's jurisdiction would gain a louder voice when it comes to the development of SEC regulations that directly apply to them. I'm pleased that Ms. Wagner was willing to accept changes to this bill I pressed for that would ensure that the SEC remains in exclusive control of the study. And whatever the outcome of the study, SEC's actions would be consistent with this overall mission. So I thank Mrs. Wagner for working with us on this bill. I also want to thank Mrs. Wagner for working with Mr. Caston to include his suggestion related to an inflation adjustment for this bill. With that, I urge my colleagues to vote yes on this bill, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentlewoman from California reserves. The gentlelady from Missouri is now recognized.
May I ask, is the gentlelady from California prepared to close?
I have no other speakers.
Okay, wonderful. Then I will reserve.
The gentlelady from Missouri reserves. The gentlewoman from California is recognized.
I simply would urge an aye vote. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back.
Mr.
Gentlewoman
Speaker,
from Missouri is recognized.
thank you, Mr. Speaker. I have no further requests for time, and I would urge my colleagues to support H.R. 2792 and yield back the balance of my time.
The question is, will the House suspend the rules and pass the bill H.R. 2792 as amended? Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. Two-thirds. For what purpose does the gentlelady seek recognition?
On that, I request the yeas and nays.
Yeas and nays are requested. All those in favor of taking this vote by the yeas and nays will rise and remain standing until counted. A sufficient number having risen, the yeas and nays are ordered. Pursuant to Clause 8 of the Rule 20, further proceedings on this question will be postponed. What purpose does the gentlewoman from Missouri seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I move to suspend the rules and pass the bill H.R. 2795, the Enhancing Multi-Class Share Disclosures Act, as amended.
The clerk will report the title of the bill.
H.R. 2795, a bill to amend the Securities Exchange Act of 1934 to require issuers with a multi-class stock structure to make certain disclosures in any proxy or consent solicitation material and for other purposes.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentlewoman from Missouri, Mrs. Wagner, and the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Waters, each will control 20 minutes. The chair now recognizes the gentlelady from Missouri.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days in which to revise and extend their remarks and include extraneous materials on this bill.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself as much time as I may consume.
Gentlewoman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I rise in support of H.R. 2795, the Enhancing Multi-Class Share Disclosures Act. I would like to thank my colleague from the other side of the aisle, Congressman Meeks, for his work on this thoughtful piece of bipartisan legislation that improves the information shareholders receive about voting power in the companies in which they invest. Since the late 1800s, U.S. companies have utilized multi-class share structures. The original intent behind these structures was to allow companies, particularly family-run enterprises, to maintain voting control without having to own the majority of equity in their company. There have been several efforts to limit the availability of multi-class share structures in the past. For example, starting in 1926 and ending in 1985, some national securities exchanges restricted the number of multi-class shares that were allowed to list on those exchanges. In response to the increasing competitiveness of national securities exchanges in the 1980s, the exchanges eased those restrictions on multi-class share structures. While the SEC Investor Advisory Committee has called for more mandatory disclosures from companies with multi-class shares, the SEC does not currently require companies to disclose the gap between the equity an individual holds in the company and the number of voting shares they control, although many companies already disclose those for their shareholders voluntarily. By requiring disclosures regarding the voting power, particularly regarding officers and directors and those who have more than 5% voting power, H.R. 2795 will ensure that shareholders receive more uniform information in proxy materials. Mr. Speaker, rather than prohibiting multi-class share structures altogether, H.R. 2795 represents a thoughtful and balanced approach to enhance transparency without eliminating class structures that encourage founders that may not otherwise go public to do so. For these reasons, I support H.R. 2795, and I urge my colleagues to support this bill. Mr. Speaker, I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentlewoman from Missouri reserves. The gentlewoman from California is now recognized.
I yield myself such time as I may consume. I rise in support of H.R. 2795, the Enhancing Multi-Class Share Disclosures Act, sponsored by the gentleman from New York. This bill closes documented gaps around multi-class governance structures. Multi-class governance structures are those where corporate insiders or beneficial owners retain an outsized amount of voting power relative to their shares. These structures, while they may add value, can pose significant risk to other investors, making sunlight ever more important for investors specifically. These structures limit investors' ability to influence management, direct strategy, and hold misaligned boards accountable. Under current rules, the difference between a corporate insider's voting power and their ownership interest, regardless of how large that gap may be, is often disclosed in many ways that are difficult for a retail investor to fully comprehend. Accordingly, the SEC Investor Advisory Committee recommended that the SEC amend its rules to ensure that this gap is better identified and quantified for investors via a disclose ratio. This common sense bill adopts this recommendation to ensure investors have the clearest information available to make the best decision for themselves. This bill is supported by a Council of Institutional Investors whose members manage trillions of dollars of assets for people all across America. So I urge my colleagues to support this bill, and I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentlewoman from California reserves. The gentlelady from Missouri is now recognized.
I reserve, Mr. Speaker.
Gentlewoman from Missouri reserves.
I now yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from New York, the sponsor of this bill, Mr. Meeks.
Mr. Meeks from New York is recognized. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I rise today to urge support of H.R. 2795, the Enhancing Multi-Class Share Disclosures Act. And I just want to thank Ranking Member Waters for her leadership, her continued support of this legislation, as she just articulated, as well as Chairwoman Wagner, who made this and worked in her support so that we really have a bipartisan bill coming together for something that is really important, as this bill, as indicated by both Ms. Waters and Ms. Wagner, closes documented gaps in transparency around multi-class governance and structures for the benefit of traditional investors, which is important because traditional investors often come from Main Street, and we want to make sure that Main Street has all of the information it needs to go further with Wall Street. These structures, while they may add value, can pose, as indicated, significant risk for investors. As also indicated, multi-class governance structures allow corporate insiders or beneficial owners to own an outsized amount of voting power relative to their shares. And this could limit other investors' abilities to influence management, direct strategy, and hold misaligned boards accountable. Accountability, having a voice. That's what this bill does. So what we want to make sure, and I want to make sure, let's be clear, that multi-class governance structures, while they do have their value, reforms are necessary. And their outright ban would do little for Main Street investors looking into a gain at return on their next startup. We've seen companies employ these structures to access the public markets and open their profits to everyday investors, while still retaining the vision and direction of their founders. Information is at the core of any well-working capital market system. Thank you. Thank you. So, as I said, we've seen companies employ these structures to access the public markets and open their profits to everyday investors. That's what it's about. The everyday investors. Open those profits so that we can see what they are while still retaining the vision and the direction of their founders. So it doesn't stop it. It makes sure there's transparency and information. Information is at the core of any well-working capital market systems, and more robust information is always best for investors. This bill will ensure that Main Street can make an informed decision as they look to invest in tomorrow's next successful business. I urge all of my colleagues to support this bill. I again thank Ranking Member Waters and Chairwoman Wagner, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Yields from California is now reserves. Gentlewoman from Missouri is now recognized.
Mr. Speaker, are there further requests for time on the other side, or does the gentlewoman from California yield back?
She's asking if you yield back.
Gentlewoman from California is
I
recognized.
yield myself the balance of the time. Yes. This bill is pro-transparency, pro-investor, and pro-corporate accountability. It strengthens investors and other stakeholders' ability to understand the risk associated with investing in companies that have dual-class share structures. I again urge my colleagues to support this bill, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlewoman yields back. Gentlewoman from Missouri is now recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I would simply urge my colleagues to support H.R. 2795, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlelady yields. The question is, will the House suspend the rules and pass the bill H.R. 2795 as amended? Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, 2/3 being the affirmative.
Speaker.
For what purposes, the lady to be recognized?
Mr. Speaker, on that, I request the yeas and the nays.
The yeas and nays are requested. All those in favor of taking this vote by the yeas and nays will rise and remain standing until counted. A sufficient number have risen. The yeas and nays are ordered. Pursuant to Clause 8 of Rule 20, further proceedings on this question will be postponed. For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Missouri seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I move to suspend the rules and pass the bill H.R. 2796, the Promoting Opportunities for Non-Traditional Capital Formation Act, as amended.
The clerk will report the title of the bill.
H.R. 2796, a bill to amend the Securities Exchange Act of 1934 to require the Advocate for Small Business Capital Formation to provide educational resources and host events to promote capital raising options for traditionally underrepresented small businesses and for other purposes.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentlewoman from Missouri, Mrs. Wagner, and the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Waters, each will control 20 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentlewoman from Missouri.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days in which to revise and extend their remarks and include extraneous materials on the bill.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself as much time as I may consume.
The gentlewoman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I rise in support of H.R. 2796, the Promoting Opportunities for Non-Traditional Capital Formation Act. I would like to thank my colleague and ranking member of the Financial Services Committee, Mrs. Waters, for her work on this common-sense bipartisan legislation to improve access to capital for underserved entrepreneurs and businesses from overlooked parts of the country. When trying to raise capital to start or grow their businesses, entrepreneurs and founders need as little friction as possible. Unfortunately, access to capital and funding is more challenging for some than others. Likewise, funding is harder to attain outside of a few select regions. For example, most venture capital funding goes to companies in just 3 states, California, Massachusetts, and New York. Likewise, less than 3% of venture dollars went to women, Black, and Latino founders. As a result, Congress should take steps to help companies and entrepreneurs from all geographic regions access to the resources that they need to grow. This bill would require the SEC's Office of the Advocate for Small Business Capital Formation, or the Advocate, to provide educational resources and host events to promote capital raising options for underrepresented small businesses and businesses in rural areas. Last month, the Financial Services Committee passed numerous bipartisan bills out of our committee to facilitate capital formation and increase access to capital for entrepreneurs and small businesses. H.R. 2796 is a common sense piece of our committee's efforts and complements the other bills that we passed. Mr. Speaker, by requiring the Advocate to provide educational resources and host events to promote capital raising options for underserved entrepreneurs, this bill will assist entrepreneurs throughout the entire country in utilizing the capital raising provisions within our securities laws best suited for their needs and circumstances. For these reasons, I urge my colleague to support H.R. 2796. And Mr. Speaker, I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentlelady from Missouri reserves. The gentlelady from California is now recognized.
Thank you very much. Mr. Speaker, I yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentlelady is recognized.
I rise in support of my bill, H.R. 2796, the Promoting Opportunities for Non-Traditional Capital Formation Act. At the beginning of this Congress, Chairman McHenry expressed an interest in working with me to pass sensible pro-investor and pro-capital formation bills, particularly if they will help small businesses. My bill would do just that. It will encourage the SEC to better serve the needs of underserved small businesses, coordinate better with states, regulators, all the while protecting investors. The Office of the Advocate for Small Business Capital Formation is an independent SEC office that was established to advance the interests of small businesses. Under my bill, The office would be directed to proactively work to identify and address unique challenges faced by minority-owned, women-owned, and rural small businesses, as well as businesses located in natural disaster areas. My bill requires the SEC's Small Business Advocate to provide educational resources and host events to promote capital raising options for these underrepresented small businesses and businesses in rural areas. We all know that oftentimes you need that face-to-face connection to tell your story, but all too often minority-owned businesses aren't invited to those gatherings. My bill would also require the office to meet annually with representatives of state securities commissions to ensure that there is a whole of government approach to addressing the unique needs of underrepresented businesses. The North American Securities Administrators Association strongly supports this legislation. Particularly, it would strengthen collaboration and coordination between regulators. Indeed, my bill makes sure that federal regulators and state regulators do just that, while at the same time advancing the cause of small business capital formation across the spectrum. So I hope my colleagues will join me in passing this bill, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentlelady from California reserves. The gentlelady from Missouri is now recognized.
Mr. Speaker, are there further requests for time on the other side, or does the gentlewoman from California, is she prepared to close and yield back?
I have no further speakers. So then I would yield myself the balance of the time.
Gentlewoman is recognized.
I'm pleased to have worked with Chairman McHenry on this bill, and I look forward to continuing to work with him on other bills that are pro-small business and pro-capital formation, while at the same time strengthening the ability of our market and investor protection agencies to do their jobs. I again urge my colleagues to support this bill, and I will yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlelady yields. Gentlewoman from Missouri is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I would just simply urge my colleagues to support H.R. 2796, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlelady yields. The question is, will the House suspend the rules and pass the bill H.R. 2796 as amended? Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, 2/3 being in the affirmative. The gentlelady, for what purposes does the lady seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, on that, I request the yeas and the nays.
The yeas and nays are requested. All those in favor of taking this vote by yeas and nays will rise and remain standing until counted. A sufficient number have risen. The yeas and nays are ordered. Pursuant to Clause 8 of Rule 20, further proceedings on this question will be postponed. A lady from Missouri seek recognition.
Mr. Speaker, I move to suspend the rules and pass the bill, H.R. 2797, the Equal Opportunity for All Investors Act, as amended.
The clerk will report the title of the bill.
H.R. 2797, a bill to amend the Securities Act of 1933 to require certification examinations for accredited investors and for other purposes.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentlewoman from Missouri, Mrs. Wagner, and the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Waters, each will control 20 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentlewoman from Missouri.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days in which to revise and extend their remarks and include extraneous material on this bill.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself as much time as I may consume.
The gentlewoman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I rise in support of H.R. 2797, the Equal Opportunity for All Investors Act. I would like to thank my colleagues, Congressman Flood and Congressman Nickel, for their work on this important piece of bipartisan legislation that will safely increase investment opportunities for everyday investors. The accredited investor definition is intended to limit private market investments to only those investors who are considered sophisticated. To qualify as an accredited investor, an individual must have an annual income of at least $200,000 or $300,000 together with a spouse for each of the previous 2 years, or a net worth of over $1 million. However, using wealth as a proxy for determining sophistication excludes a large pool of investors who may have other types of expertise or experience. According to estimates from the Securities and Exchange Commission, the SEC, in 2016, about 13% of U.S. households qualified as accredited investors. Additionally, only about 1.3% and 2.8% of accredited investors are Black and Latino, respectively. H.R. 2797 represents a thoughtful approach to expanding the accredited investors definition to include individuals who are certified through an examination established by the SEC and administered by FINRA. Under this bill, if you can demonstrate competency with these types of investments through an exam, then you qualify as an accredited investor. Mr. Speaker, by expanding the pathways to qualify as an accredited investor beyond wealth tests, this bill modernizes the outdated definition that has inappropriately sidelined sophisticated but not wealthy individuals from high-growth asset classes historically reserved for the wealthiest individuals. By doing so, this legislation will help more American families realize the American dream by building wealth through our capital markets. For these reasons, I urge my colleagues to support H.R. 2797, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentlelady from Missouri reserves. The gentlewoman from California is now recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself such time as I may consume. I rise in support of H.R. 2797, the Equal Opportunity for All Investors Act, sponsored by the gentleman from Nebraska. The accredited investor framework serves to protect the general public from investing in high-risk, illiquid private securities because they lack the safeguards that are a feature of public securities. Unlike our public capital markets, companies do not provide anywhere near the same financial and other disclosures to investors for private offerings. Private securities also do not offer the same legal protections for investors. The SEC and state securities regulators do not have the same ability to police the private markets as they can the public markets. The general rationale behind the comparative lack of regulations governing private securities is that institutional investors, like private equity funds, hedge funds, banks, and others, can demand the disclosures from the company in exchange for their investment and have significant legal resources to hold the company accountable. These Wall Street players and other big money investors don't necessarily need the same level of protections when investing as compared to retail investors like working families do. The accredited investor definition ensures that those who are eligible to invest in private securities do in fact have the knowledge to know these heightened risks. Initially, the SEC defined accredited investors to be those who possess an intimate understanding of the risk and had the knowledge, the very knowledge base, to decide whether to invest in these particular types of securities. But companies needing to raise capital privately and the underwriters and intermediaries facilitating these capital raising activities argued for a simpler approach. So the SEC adopted the current definition, which is based on financial resources. Today, an accredited investor must meet 3 criteria. They must have a net worth, either individually or with a spouse, exceeding $1 million, excluding the value of their home. make more than $200,000 a year or $300,000 with a spouse, or since 2020 hold certain professional certifications or designations such as being an investment advisor or broker. This bill being considered under suspension today aim to return to the original concept of accredited investor, which is that investors in these high-risk investment offerings should be fully aware and knowledgeable of the risk involved. We all know that just because you have $1 million, it doesn't mean that you understand the complexities of investing. This is why it is important for the SEC to also update the current thresholds so that Wall Street intermediaries are not able to sell unregulated securities to individuals who have become accredited solely based on the inflated value of their retirement assets. For example, unfortunately, there are millions of accredited investors who are now being solicited to invest in products they have little knowledge about, and the SEC should act to amend the definition of the accredited investors, protect those investors. On the other hand, we've heard from some investors who really want to try their luck with some of these risky and illiquid investments, but do not qualify as an accredited investor because they don't meet the wealth or the income test. The Equal Opportunity for All Investors Act would solve the latter part of this problem by allowing an individual to qualify as an accredited investor if they pass an exam that ensures they are sufficiently versed in the risk of investing in the private markets. Generally, private markets are understood to have a higher potential for total loss and can be significantly illiquid than the public markets. So, having a deep understanding of these risks is necessary to navigate this space. In addition, there are fewer protections for investors when things go wrong with an investment. With this change, any investor who wants to invest in private securities can now do so if they can pass this test, which would establish that they are keenly aware of the particular risk related to high-risk and illiquid securities, as well as the conflicts of interest presented when financial professionals sell these products to investors. So I want to thank Mr. Flood and Chair McHenry for working with me to ensure that the test in this bill is established by the SEC and that it contains specific, robust elements that witnesses at previous committee hearings talked about when discussing how they teach and mentor their budding investors. I'm also pleased that the test in this bill would be available free of charge. So I think that this bill will solve the problem of people who are ready to invest, who are not millionaires, they're not billionaires, but they're smart. And they know how to determine what the risks are. And if they're prepared to take them, then let them do so. So I urge my colleagues to vote yes on this bill, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentlelady reserves. The gentlelady from Missouri is now recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I am now happy to yield to the gentleman from Nebraska, Mr. Flood, the author of this piece of legislation, for as much time as he may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
I thank the gentlewoman from Missouri. The Equal Opportunity for All Investors Act of 2023 will give Americans new opportunities to grow their wealth and savings. I'd like to thank Chairman McHenry, Chairwoman Wagner, Ranking Member Waters, and my Democratic co-lead, Wiley Nickel, for their support of my bill. This legislation expands the accredited investor definition to include individuals that are certified, as you've heard today, through an exam written by the SEC and administered by FINRA. It is my firm belief that the accredited investor definition should not be tied exclusively to wealth. Instead, we should unlock opportunities for knowledgeable investors that may not come from means. This bill strikes an effective balance. It brings more investors into the accredited investor pool, but also contains guardrails that would filter out individuals that do not fully understand private offerings and the investment risks associated with them. We have legislation today that would make for a thorough but fair examination for investors that want to become accredited investors. I urge my colleagues to support my bill, and I yield back the balance of the time that I was granted.
Gentlelady from Missouri is recognized.
I reserve.
Gentlewoman reserves. Gentlelady from California
I
is
now
recognized.
yield 3 minutes to the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Nickel, the lead co-sponsor of this bill.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm proud to rise as the co-lead of the Equal Opportunity for All Investors Act with my Republican colleague Mike Flood from the great state of Nebraska. Our bipartisan bill cuts through government red tape to improve choices for investors, regardless of their net worth. This will result in greater access to capital for minorities, veterans, and women, and will also spur economic growth in places like North Carolina's Research Triangle Park. Under the current system, only millionaires can be accredited investors. We want to open up lucrative private securities investments to individuals who have the financial knowledge to understand the risk they're taking on, but aren't necessarily millionaires. Our bill does just that by expanding the accredited investor definition, which is what allows people to invest in private securities, to include individuals that are certified through a robust exam established by the SEC and administered by FINRA. If you're able to pass a test demonstrating you're financially sophisticated enough to take on the risk of investing in private securities, you should be considered an accredited investor without having to be a millionaire. North Carolina's Research Triangle Park is an essential economic driver for my district. It's home to many small biotech companies working on critical, life-changing technologies. Many of these companies rely on accredited investors for capital, so our larger pool of investors will improve their access to funding, spurring growth and bringing good jobs to working families in North Carolina's 13th Congressional District and around the country. Additionally, according to Brookings, the average net worth of a typical white family is nearly 10 times greater than that of a black family. By allowing individuals to become accredited investors regardless of their net worth, this bill will enable more diverse investors to participate in that asset class. Underrepresented entrepreneurs often struggle to access capital, and they'd greatly benefit from a larger pool of more diverse investors that look like them. I want to thank my colleague and co-lead Mike Flood and our Financial Services Committee ranking member Maxine Waters for her support and her leadership of this bill, along with Chair Patrick McHenry. Listen, Mr. Speaker, the only real solutions in this Congress are going to be bipartisan solutions. This legislation is the result of Democrats and Republicans working together to improve the lives of the people we represent. I urge my colleagues to join me in supporting the Equal Opportunity for All Investors Act, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields. Gentlelady from Missouri is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, are there further requests for time on the other side, or does the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Waters, prepare to close and yield back?
I have no further speakers, and I'm prepared to close if the gentlewoman from Missouri has no speakers. Thank you.
Gentlewoman from California is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself the balance of the time. It is important to appropriately tailor the accredited investor definition to protect those who do not have the requisite knowledge to make certain investments while creating a pathway for those who have demonstrable knowledge about the risk associated with investing in private securities. I believe this bill would ensure that those who possess the knowledge and risk appetite for privately issued securities are able to invest in those. I again urge my colleagues to support this bill that is offered by Mr. Flood and Mr. Nickel, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlelady yields. Gentlelady from Missouri is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I would strongly urge my colleagues to support H.R. 2797, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentlelady yields. The question is, will the House suspend the rules and pass the bill H.R. 2797 as amended? Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, 2/3 being in the affirmative.
Mr. Speaker?
For what purpose does the woman like to be recognized?
Mr. Speaker, on that, I request the yeas and the nays.
The yeas and nays are requested. All those in favor of taking this vote by the yeas and nays will rise and remain standing until counted. A sufficient number having risen, the yeas and nays are ordered. Pursuant to Clause 8 of Rule 20, further proceedings on this question will be postponed. What